Welcome to Thursday, November 9th, 2023, your Day Weather Podcast being brought to you by Cowboy State Daily, Wyoming's only daily newspaper. Check them out at cowboystatedaily.com. Pretty quiet weather coming for a bit. We have seen a trend here to cool us off a little bit. We saw precipitation in a few areas over the last couple of days. Nothing to write home about, and there's really nothing to write home about between now and through the weekend. We're going to have seasonal temperatures with windy areas this weekend, especially along and east of the Continental Divide is going to be a little windy, especially along I-80, I-25 corridors as we go into Saturday and Sunday. But all of the really active weather is going to be pretty far away. So we're going to be looking at very little precipitation in the west, temperatures close to average, a little bit above normal by the weekend and into early next week. Stormy weather begins to move into and along the west coast by the middle to the latter portions of next week. So that stormy weather we showed you yesterday headed towards the west coast, that's on tap. The question is going to be, what happens after that west coast storm moves inland? Is it going to break apart? Is it going to hold together? It will bring bigger changes to the central Rockies and the central high plains and the southern Rockies as we get into the end of next week and next weekend. But we just don't know of what caliber, whether or not it's going to be a big change in the weather or one that's going to cool us down. But for certain, the West Coast is going to see the first major storm of the cold season. What happens after that, we're just going to have to monitor it. Also, at the end of this podcast, it's been back in the news here about Super El Nino. There's Super El Nino talk again, and that is something that is a little bit head-scratching based on just the data we're seeing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that because it's getting back in the press again. Satellite photo this morning shows a really big storm. We'll talk about this here in a second. Up here in the Gulf of Alaska, not very far from Anchorage there, while high pressure, as you can see, there's not much going on in the western United States. There's a pipeline of moisture coming up out of Mexico that's going to bring wet weather to southern New Mexico, Texas, and the southern plains. But boy, all of the weather is either really far to our south or really far to our north and west, so not much going on. But if we were to focus in, look at that storm. This is a good sign of what's coming. Notice here, very strong jet stream winds are moving across the North Pacific. We've got this storm that's just pummeling Alaska right now. So there's a lot going on upstream. And eventually, those changes upstream in the Pacific will translate into the western United States mid to late next week. But at the meantime, things are going to stay out there. But look at the graphic from the National Weather Service out of Anchorage, talking about the anywhere from blizzard warnings to flood watches, just getting battered there in southern and southeastern Alaska from that storm. But it's going to stay up there, kind of get stalled out and then dissipate slowly and waiting the next one coming on in. And there you can see it right up here right now. But for the western United States and most of the west, we generally have a west to east flow off the Pacific. This is what's left behind from yesterday's front and storm system that went on through. So that'll still keep it a little bit cooler. This is for Saturday. There's a little wave coming through right here. That will produce a little bit of shower activity over northwestern Wyoming, Montana, the Pacific Northwest, but really what it's going to do is make for windy conditions. This is the precipitation forecast through Sunday. So other than up here in the Pacific Northwest, down here, a few showers over Yellowstone Park, it's a real yawner. Just very little going on. But there will be wind. These are the potential wind gusts between now and Sunday. So the usual wind-prone areas of Wyoming, going to be looking at some wind as we go into the weekend. Very windy. North central Montana up here along the U.S.-Canadian border as those lows come on through. So we'll have to deal with a little bit of wind, but there'll be Chinook winds, and that'll make temperatures mild. Longer term, this is where this West Coast storm system moves in. What happens after this period of time? This is for next Wednesday. So you can see low pressure stretched out from British Columbia, moving into central and southern California. So there's going to be plenty of weather here. It's what happens the few days after next Wednesday where you just don't have high confidence level yet. But some of this, what's left of this, is going to translate eastward by late next week and next weekend. So there's going to be some weather, but we'll have to get closer for any details. This is the precipitation forecast through Thursday. So you can see the encroachment of the heavier West Coast precipitation moving in by the middle to the end of next week. And still, though, along the divide and east of the divide, there's still not much happening yet. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what's been making the news here lately. Been a lot of headlines like this. One of the most intense El Niños ever could be forming. Well, I've got to just throw a flag here, just like in football. I just got to throw a flag. So we're just going to call this clickbait. If we go back here, it says an experimental forecast. Okay, an experimental forecast is fine. But if you don't have a model that's been well developed over time and has a long track record, you should not be making categorical statements that this is the most intense El Nino ever off an experimental forecast. That's just not good. That is bad science. And I have to throw the flag at the Washington Post, the New York Times, many other major media outlets, and this is just to get you to click on the story. The National Weather Service's own Climate Prediction Center, this is what they said in their last update. There's a 30% chance, a 3 in 10% chance of an historically strong event that rivals 2015 and 16 and 1997 and 98. Also, they say stronger El Nino events do not necessarily equate to strong impacts locally. So we have some contradictions going on here. We have an experimental model, and then we have the people who are in charge and have been in charge of predicting and observing El Ninos and La Ninas saying something really diametrically opposed. It's just, yeah, there's a 30% chance of a strong event, but not the biggest ever. And then let's look at the data now. Does the data support clickbait claims? Well, here we are right now. If we were to measure this is sea surface temperature anomaly, right now we're on the right side of this graph. We're right here at strong. The strongest event we've seen in recent times was 2015 and 16. Back to these were super El Ninos, okay? This would fit the category super El Ninos. 97, 98 was very memorable. 2015 and 16 was strong. This is the strongest since 2009. So yeah, it's strong if we only look at sea surface temperature. But you can't only look at sea surface temperature to dictate or to come up with a conclusion of how strong the El Nino is going to be. This is basically, you see right here, this is a coalition of models. All these different things you see here in lines and colors are the different models that they run to predict sea surface temperature changes and whether or not we're in an El Nino or La Nina state. The purple line is the average of all of these. Interesting thing right here is we're actually at the peak strength right now. Here we are, November, December, January, the 3-month period of when it's supposed to reach its peak, which is around 2 degrees Celsius anomaly out there in the subtropical Pacific. Now, some models, like this one up here, is at 2.5. This one down here is way off the charts. You never pick one model. You never pick one model in situations like this. But when we take a look at the forecast, it actually shows it peaking over the next 3 months, then El Nino weakening. So we're at its near peak now, but it's going to be weakening through the winter. And another way to show this maybe easier is to show the probability of El Nino is 100%, dropping rapidly by late spring and into summer. So don't quite understand the headlines. And another way to do this is what is used as the MEI. This is a way to have a metric for the La Nina and El Nino states. The MEI is basically how does the atmosphere respond to the changes in the sea surface temperatures. The sea surface temperature changes will affect the atmosphere, and that's where we get the impacts of El Nino and La Ninas. The MEI is a way to measure that, so you come up with a number. And if we look at the sea surface temperature anomalies now, where we are right at this particular time, you can see the El Nino right there. This is what it looked like in 2015 into 2016. You can see it's more intense, stronger, stretching out more across the Pacific. This is 1997 when a really strong El Nino formed. And again, the sea surface temperature anomalies here are very, very strong. But if you just look at it from a graphical standpoint, this year doesn't stack up yet. So let's look at the MEI. This goes back to 2020. The MEI, when it's negative, is La Nina. That's why it's blue for cold. This is the long phase of La Nina we had that went for so long. We got out of La Nina this last winter and spring, and we're at 0.6 on the MEI scale You have to be a 0.5 on the MEI scale to be considered an El Nino status. Look what happened in the last update. It went 0.6 to 0.3. So the atmospheric response to these sea surface temperature changes is not strong. It's not super. This is the data. And if we were to just compare this and let's put that same data in a graph, this is where we are now. This is where we were in 2016. And if we were to compare where we are now to the last really strong El Nino events, the last 5 right there, the gray line is where we are now. Again, falling very far short of where we were with other El Ninos. So be careful. Be very, very careful on what you read, because a lot of times what's reported doesn't match up with the data. Have yourself a good Thursday. We'll see you tomorrow.